Good morning, church. I forgot to press the button to record yesterday's message. And so I'm doing a separate recording for those who were not there with us yesterday. Yesterday's topic was on resting in God. In introducing the topic, I spoke a bit first about death that is gripping the hearts of many people. You see, death is never a pleasant subject to talk about. To many people, it evokes fear because we fear what lies beyond death. We fear losing loved ones. We fear the possible pain when sickness threatens death. So death is often associated with fear. That is why Hebrews 2:14 verse 15 says, "Now since the children referring to us in humanity, who are human, have flesh and blood, he, is Jesus, too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free all those who through their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death." So Christians, therefore, should never really fear death. But unfortunately, many still do. So in this present coronavirus pandemic, death seems to lurk everywhere. And the social media, which we so love, the Facebook, WhatsApp, and whether they are fake news or real news, the more we read, the more we have fear in our heart. And even now we read that Malaysia has got many people dying from coronavirus. Now, the first COVID-19 death in Malaysia happened to a pastor aged 60 years old, Pastor David Cheng Lip Kyong from the Emmanuel Baptist Church in Kuching. Ming and I have been to that church before and spoken there. And recently we met Pastor David Cheng, who is their worship pastor at the dedication of the Footprint Travel Planner office. At that time, he was leading the worship. Who would expect that in a short while he would die? Now, if a pastor can catch it and die, some Christian will ask, what about me as an ordinary Christian? What happened to Psalms 91 that we are told to pray from? And another thought that strikes me recently when reading the condolences or obituaries that people extend, I noticed that many often use the phrase "rest in peace." And so it seems to suggest to me that the only peace to come to people is when we die. Only when we die do we get to have rest. Now, is that really what it should be? What about when we are alive? Will we always be unrest in our spirit? Will we always be stressed out by our daily life and never ever having peace and rest in our spirit? Is that the way we are meant to live? So just last Tuesday, when conducting the wake service for one of our brothers, my thoughts were drawn to the 3 verses that Jesus said to his disciples. Let me tell them to you. "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will receive rest, and you will find rest in your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Let me now share the screen with you of the message that I'm going to speak from. So we're talking about resting in God. Let's look at the first verse, the first part of the verse that I just told you, the promise. Here Jesus says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He's addressing it to people who labor and are heavy laden. And he was addressing to the world, as it were. You see, there are two kinds of yoke. And one is the yoke of the world, which is put on us by Satan. And the other is the yoke that Jesus will ask us to take up later. Now, in this yoke that Satan has put upon us, it turns our life, daily life, our everyday life into labor. The work we do gives us rest not heavily. We don't seem to have rest in our spirit. And people are stressed out. You know, as we look around us in the world, that seems to be what's happening even right now. And many of us would say that when we did not know Christ before, we were laboring under a heavy yoke upon ourselves. There was no joy, there was no satisfaction. And many times you hear people say, I wish I was a child again, when my spirit was free. There was no responsibility. I could just run out into the garden. I could just play and maybe even get wet in the rain, and there was no care upon me. But now as an adult, my shoulders are laden and with responsibility, and it's like the joy of life is squeezed out from me. But Jesus said this, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Now, is that a promise that is meant to be true, or is it just some encouraging words? So, he promised that he will give us rest. In coming into the rest of God, he's actually saying that you and I can come into rest in our spirit and have the heavy burdens taken off us before we die, not only when we die. So this promise is to us. But now, let's look at how it's going to be fulfilled. So let's look at the conditions. And its verse says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. So the first condition really is to put off the world's yoke and to put on the Lord's yoke. You and I are carrying a heavy yoke. You know what a yoke is like? A yoke is something that binds you to another thing, like two oxen may be yoked together to pull a load. And when we were in the world before, we were yoked by Satan with the world that he has put us in, and we have to labor. And it's a heavy yoke. It's a type of that yoke, like I mentioned yesterday, would be like that of the children of Israel when they were in captivity in Egypt. It was a type of this heavy yoke. And what happened then was that Pharaoh made them labor, and daily their life was suffering and working towards no purpose, and there was no rest in the spirit. It was hard labor. There was no joy, no satisfaction in the things that they do, until Moses delivered them and brought them out of Egypt. So when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, he's actually saying, come to me as the one to be your Lord now. Take off the yoke of the world. Take off Satan's control and power over you through false religion, that we have to pay penance to receive forgiveness, and the many other things that we're told to do. For some who are not religious, they will look at it and say, oh, I'm going to make my life successful, and then perhaps I will find joy in life and happiness. But often that eludes many people, even those who are very wealthy. So when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, it actually first of all means that you must put off the world's yoke. You've got to come to him as the one who died for you and through his death destroy Satan and his power over you. You're going to come to Jesus and receive him as your Lord and put on the Lord's yoke. God has a yoke, and he wants us to take it upon ourselves. He wants us to be yoked with him, to live with him. So the first condition to coming into our rest, because it says, if you take my yoke, you will find rest for your souls. The first condition is to come to Jesus. Now, unfortunately, some of us as Christians have come to Jesus and taken his yoke, but after that, we just go back to our usual way of life, and we take back the load of Satan. We walked away from the grace of God that tells us that he will provide for everything we need. That if we were to trust him and live life in his ways and in his way and hear from him and do the things he asks us to do, and he will provide. He will take care of us. He will take care of our family. So we sometimes take back the yoke of the world upon ourselves, and then we become heavy laden again. So besides coming to Jesus in the prayer of acceptance, you have to come to Jesus on a daily basis. You have to let the Lord take those yokes away from you. Now that comes to the second part. Take my yoke upon you, which we just talked about, and learn from me. Now, what it means is that come into a discipleship journey with Jesus. You know, we do discipleship in Connect groups, but the purpose of that is not just for us to learn scripture verse, stories, and begin to sort of like say, I know the scripture, and we can spout out scripture. But actually, the whole purpose of discipleship is that we may become like him. Not just in holiness alone, but also in the way in which he lived. That's why Jesus said, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. And then you will find rest. So there are two things here. Take my yoke, come to Jesus, have him be the Lord and Master of your life. Second, come into a discipleship journey with him. Learn a new lifestyle. This lifestyle that Jesus speaks about is a lifestyle where he says that I am gentle and lowly in heart. Now, these two things seems to be the quality of life that we need to have as we look at Jesus for us to find rest for our souls. So let's just look at the next thing. What does it mean, gentle and lowly in heart? Now, this few points, the first 3 points are picked up from Spurgeon in one of his messages. What is gentleness? Gentleness is a strong hand with a soft touch. Now, Jesus, as a gentle person, wasn't wishy-washy. He knew what was right, he knew what was wrong, and he was firm. He was strong about the things that matter. But he was able to communicate and speak the truth in a way that others can receive. Sometimes, whether we're at work or in our home, we know what's right and wrong, but we become very aggressive in our spirit. We become very stressed out by not seeing people doing the things we want to do, and we want to make them do the right thing. And so it creates a lot of unrest in us. I've learned over the years that I can be right about something, but if I have a strong hand with a hard touch and I want to make people do things the way I want them to do, it actually has a pushback. People may listen and then go and do the other thing, or may rebel. And that gives me, and it gives you such a stress in your heart to see this reaction against you. But if we would be like Jesus, be firm and speak and give it and leave it to the people to make a decision and not be frustrated. Let that rich young ruler walk away. Don't run after him. Let the scribes and Pharisees digest the word you speak. Don't let it stir in you such an anger that you're not receiving what you say. So when you're gentle, when you learn to be gentle, like Jesus. You learn to communicate truth and leave it to the people whether they should receive it or not. And usually when we speak truth with a soft touch, people will receive. So true followers of Christ are distinguished by gentleness, not by arrogance. They are not arrogant, but humble or lowly in spirit. Now contrast it to some of the people we see. It says here Christ is gentle and lowly in heart. And compare it to some of the ferocity and arrogance of spirit revealed by zealots and bigots. Now these are people who are absolutely certain of what they believe in, and it could be true, but you can see them pounding on the podium and demanding people to share their point of view, and it comes across with such an aggressive spirit. But Jesus was never like that. So may we learn that the words that we speak, as we speak in gentleness and lowliness of heart, can be received by people. And so that's the next thing that we look at. If we put off the yoke of the world, put on the yoke of the Lord, and be discipled with him, then we learn that the yoke of the Lord is easy and his burden is light. And that's the promise. For you will find rest for your soul. And that's the promise that God has given to us. And the mark, therefore, of the yoke of the Lord, for us to know whether we are now operating under the yoke of the Lord or under the yoke of this world, is that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. May God bless his word, and may you be blessed by what God is speaking to you today.